Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, a media snapshot from one of the world's most secretive states. North Korea reveals its leader in waiting, and the satirists take their cues from that. A year and a half into Zimbabwe's unity government, but what has that meant for local journalists trying to cover their own country? And parliamentary elections are coming up in Egypt, and one of the country's most outspoken journalists gets fired. In the old secretive days of the Soviet Union, there was a term, Kremlinologists, used to describe the journalists and diplomats who struggled to understand the inner workings of the government in Moscow. There's a term that's now in use, Pyongyanologists. These are the people trying to figure out just what is going on within the power structure of North Korea. On the 30th of September, North Korea watchers spotted a photograph on the front page of the national daily newspaper, Rodong Singmun. It was a wide shot of the senior ranks of the ruling party. Look carefully, and you can see a young man seated one chair away from Korean leader Kim Jong-il. That's Kim Jong-un, the leader's youngest son. The picture has been interpreted as a clear sign that Kim Jong-un is destined to follow as leader. Now, one picture is not a lot to go on, but in a country where the national media are entirely state-run, foreign journalists are banned, and press releases do not exist, that's how news is conveyed. Our starting point this week is the hyper-secretive northern half of the Korean peninsula, where spies, analysts, and diplomats dig for clues in the absence of news.
Picking a crown prince to run North Korea's closed society.
Everything about North Korea is news because there's so little in the way of information that we have.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-il has named his son as a four-star military general before he becomes the country's next leader.
It was low-key but unmistakable.
Finally, they show the picture of the next leader of North Korea.
The first official glimpse of the likely future face of North Korea.
It was of genuine historical importance, and also I think a great media story because of the whole obscurity.
Obscure is how North Korea likes it. The reclusive country is almost completely closed to foreign media. What little information that does get out comes from North Koreans themselves.
The main way that we hear about what is going on in North Korea is that the state news agency puts out news and information every day. These are the official government pronouncements. Often they are very regimented and they just say, this anniversary has happened, these officials went out to a concert or a performance, or they went to visit a factory, or things like that. It's not really that instructive.
Imagine that you wanted complete control of your subjects' hearts and minds. Then you would do what North Korea has attempted to do. Namely, you would ensure that only the state was the sole source of every single piece of information, mass media included.
So when that image was transmitted, indicating that Kim Jong-un appeared to have been chosen to be the next leader of North Korea, news outlets around the world scrambled to interpret and analyze what it all meant.
Control over the secretive Stalinist regime will remain a family affair.
Korean Workers' Party conference was managed down to the last detail because that's the way the North Korean regime manages all of these meetings. At the end of the conference, they released these photos, and you have Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un sitting in front of this mass congregation of military officers and civilians.
Until fairly recently, intelligence agencies around the world, they didn't have a clue of how he looked like. The only picture available was that when he was 12 in Switzerland as a middle school student. North Korea was so secretive, there has been no adult picture of a successor.
This is really meant to show that everybody in the party supports the transfer of power from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. You know, everyone's there standing behind it, literally and figuratively. So this was really meant to be a message not only to the North Korean people, but of course to the rest of the world, that Kim Jong-un is going to be the third Kim on the throne.
And that is the entire point of North Korea's media policy, to maintain the Kim family's rule and block out anything that does not come with the government's official seal of approval. Within the country, news and information is gathered and distributed by the government-run Korean Central News Agency. There are 12 main newspapers and 4 television channels. And often the exuberance with which positive news is broadcast on those state-run channels is comedic.
The goal of North Korea propaganda system is to maintain the system of dictatorship. And to maintain the dictatorship, their propaganda should work.
North Korea always ranks dead last when it comes to these global media rankings. North Korea doesn't have any independent media. It has state media, which just really puts out the Kim Jong-il's line.
There's no internet in North Korea, actually. They use intranet. And people in North Korea, they don't subscribe to foreign news magazines either. They are not allowed to. So there is total information isolation.
It remains the case that in North Korea, if you buy a radio, the radio is actually physically soldered inside so that it is tuned to the North Korean radio stations. It would be illegal and dangerous to twiddle the knobs and pick up some nice hip-hop from South Korea or something, but it's physically impossible.
North Korean propaganda used to show pictures of South Korea. Whenever there was a big demonstration or riot, this would be on North Korean TV. Basically, the North Koreans stopped doing this because the North Korean people started to notice that the South Korean people were dressed very well, they looked prosperous, they were fat, which was not what the North Korean propaganda line was, which was that the people in South Korea were destitute, that they were even worse off than the people in North Korea.
It's not just the information flow within North Korea that is kept under tight control. The regime also keeps a lid on information flowing out beyond the country's borders.
Well, I often describe reporting on North Korea as being a stenographer. You sort of record what they have said, and then you talk to lots of people about it, but you don't get to talk to the actual source.
There's a dynamic that has been created. Oftentimes we will see news reports in the South Korean papers, in the Japanese papers about something that supposedly went on. And because there's so little news about North Korea, everybody latches on to these reports and it becomes accepted gospel very quickly, whether it's credible or not.
For the Kim Korean dynasty, international perceptions, even misperceptions, are of little concern. The Kims are still in power, and as long as they remain there, they can argue their media strategy is working, even if to the rest of the world, the country they rule looks like an anachronism, an outsider in this, the age of information. Our Global Village voices now on the mysterious media story in North Korea.
If you look at the entire history of the DPRK, you will see a very strong consistency of stiff-arming the media. So I think it would be rather unrealistic in a way to expect any dramatic changes regarding the media and any openness with this third generation coming into view in the distance.
North Korea has maintained this image of being an enigmatic regime because it wants the international media's attention, and at the meantime they want to be the ones controlling the message coming out of the regime.
It's ironic, isn't it, that at a time when the North Korean government opens Twitter and YouTube accounts to pour out its propaganda and anti-Western vitriol, that hardly any of its population even has access to the World Wide Web, let alone the outside world.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The editor of Egypt's independent Al Dastour newspaper, Ibrahim Issa, has been sacked by the paper's publisher. Mr. Issa said he was dismissed hours after being told not to run an article by leading opposition figure Mohammed El-Baradei. Critics say the move bodes badly for the state of media freedom in the country ahead of Egypt's parliamentary elections next month. Dozens of journalists at the newspaper staged a sit-in protest once the news of Issa's firing came down. Just 2 weeks ago, we reported on the media story in Kashmir and how balanced coverage of that story has become one of the casualties of the political conflict there. Doesn't look like the situation's getting any better. A TV news anchor for Associated Press Television, Miraj Udindar, was allegedly beaten up by Indian police while he drove to work in Srinagar, in Indian-occupied Kashmir. in an attack that left the reporter in the hospital. The anchor's son, also an AP reporter, was hurt as well. Journalists working in the region have condemned the assault, saying that they feel increasingly vulnerable as the Indian government tries to quell civil unrest against its rule. Back in July, Reporters Without Borders reported that 12 journalists were beaten up while covering a demonstration. India's Minister for Kashmir, Omar Abdullah, has called the reporter to apologize and said a police officer and 2 constables have been suspended from duty while the investigation is carried out. Russian police are saying they will pursue fresh investigation into 19 cases of murder, all against journalists in that country, and none of them solved. The pledge came after a meeting with the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ. That's a New York-based media rights group that released a report last year on the cases and has been campaigning for action ever since. The CPJ publishes a list of countries where the murders of journalists are either infrequently or never solved. Russia ranks 8th on that list, behind countries such as Iraq, Somalia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Colombia, Afghanistan, and Nepal, and just ahead of Mexico and Pakistan. A French newspaper has been blamed for the breakdown of an arms deal between France and the United Arab Emirates, but scratch beneath the surface, and there's more to this story than meets the eye. The newspaper which published the article in question, France's second largest paper, Le Figaro, is owned by conservative politician Serge Dassault. Dassault's family owns the aircraft manufacturer Dassault Aviation. The manufacturer was about to sign a deal worth billions of dollars to sell warplanes to the UAE, but the article in the right-leaning paper in June stopped the deal short. The story claimed that the UAE used Israeli technology to help secure its borders, a sensitive subject for Arab nations. With the deal now off, at least temporarily, Dassault has learned a valuable lesson. Customers won't buy Dassault products if the Dassault-owned newspaper makes journalistic waves. A TV anchor has been summarily fired from CNN for remarks that suggested that American Jews have a disproportionate amount of influence in the U.S. broadcast news industry. Rick Sanchez had been an anchor with CNN for 6 years, but in an explosive rant during a radio interview, he managed to kill off his CNN career. The interviewer asked Sanchez about the mocking he regularly suffered at the hands of Jon Stewart on Comedy Central's Daily Show, the self-styled fake news program.
Rick Sanchez delivers the news.
Sanchez suggested that Stewart disapproved of him because Sanchez is different, a Hispanic American. He called Jon Stewart a bigot. Sanchez then scoffed at the interviewer's point that, as an American Jew, Stewart was a member of an oppressed minority. Sanchez replied, quote, "Everybody who runs CNN is a lot like Stewart, and a lot of people who run all the other networks are a lot like Stewart." And to imply that somehow they, the people in this country who are Jewish, are an oppressed minority, yeah, unquote. He was being sarcastic. CNN fired Sanchez the next day, saying Rick Sanchez is no longer with the company. We thank Rick for his years of service, and we wish him well. We're back after the break with the second part of our look at the Zimbabwean media. Welcome back. Last month, we reported on the lack of new media outlets in Zimbabwe under the unity government there. When Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party agreed to share power with Morgan Tsvangirai's movement for democratic change, the two parties promised to open up the airwaves and loosen up the newspaper landscape to allow journalists the freedom to report without fear of reprisal. So far, progress has been slow, but there has been some. Accredited foreign media are operating more openly, but what we went to Zimbabwe to find out was, does that new openness extend to local journalists? What challenges do they face in getting the story out, if not to the world, but to their local communities, the people most affected by Zimbabwean politics? The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now with a report on Zimbabwe and how the promise of an open media has fallen short.
The Prime Minister Richard Morgan Tsvangirai.
The coalition agreement essentially promised to free up the media.
Where a person is free to express an opinion loudly and openly.
But that's not happening in the manner that people would consider as, substantive reform.
One of the conditions of the power-sharing agreement between Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party and Morgan Tsvangirai's Movement for Democratic Change was to protect and enshrine freedom of expression for the benefit of all Zimbabweans.
I think there is always the fear of journalists getting arrested. I think that is real. Government has got a lot in its arsenal. There are at least 5 pieces of legislation that can be used. So journalism is still criminalized as far as we are concerned.
We're just getting piecemeal reform and mainly centered on areas where they are comfortable letting go.
Here is an example of one of those piecemeal reforms, a news conference by the Zimbabwe National Park Service in response to reports that the country was secretly selling animals to North Korea.
If things happen in the wildlife sector, going to the Sunday Times as your first port of call does not help conservation.
Just 2 years ago, a news conference like this would not have taken place. Firstly, the chances of this story breaking would have been slim because the government had almost complete control over the media. But even if the story did make it into the public domain, then it would have been highly unlikely that the government would have engaged with its critics and the media in a manner that was open and transparent.
And I think the journalists, you as the media, you've got a role to play to correct these perceptions.
The new unity government has now licensed several independent newspapers, but is yet to issue a single new license in television or radio. That's because they, and by they we mean the ZANU-PF, who control the country's broadcast licensing authority, know that the overwhelming majority of Zimbabweans get their news from broadcast media, over the airwaves.
Print media, you know, you can speculate whatever you think, but with a camera, you say as it is. You are like an ambassador of those who will not be at the place. You'll be telling the people exactly what is there.
Cameraman Anderson Maniere knows there's a high price to pay for showing viewers exactly what is there. In April this year, he was arrested while covering this protest. He told us that he's been arrested 3 times this year alone.
What made him of particular interest to the regime was, of course, his work as a photojournalist. I'm sure you will appreciate how powerful sometimes images and pictures can be. I only need to give the example of Tsvangirai when he was beaten up by the police. I mean, pictures of him created international outrage.
And here is the face of the opposition, Morgan Tsvangirai, in his hospital bed.
And it is that sort of thing that the government wants to control.
The threat of prison is still very real for Zimbabwean journalists. So to get around that, many of them sell their work to foreign media outlets. But foreign audiences have developed an appetite for a certain kind of story from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwean journalists who want to sell their story feel the need to perpetuate, even exaggerate the stereotype.
You know, in the last decade, Zimbabwe was the political story. We were the flavor of the year in terms of the Southern African region. And there was a feeling amongst journalists, amongst many of us, that there was a certain template we were following. When you were writing for the international media, you had to write a story in a certain way. You had to have the catchphrases, you know, disaster, political violence, oppressive dictator. So I think we lost a little of our own ideas and our own story.
Zimbabwean journalists face myriad challenges. They meet frequently to discuss them. The ongoing grievance is the slow pace of media reform.
After laboring for 15 months, we were presented with a so-called Media Commission. And 3 months after it took off, nothing has happened.
At least this meeting was held in the open. They used to happen in secret, so some things are changing. A bit more transparency and more independent journalism in Zimbabwe's print media. But the government is far more reluctant to loosen its grip on broadcast media. And the story about elephants being sold to North Korea? That never made it onto Zimbabwean television.
Zimbabwe is not where it should be in terms of, free media activity, the ability for journalists to work without worrying about consequence. It's not where it should be, but it's certainly not where it was.
We have seen some change, but not the change that we have been yearning for, where one day we would wake up and see more titles on the street. I would wake up to switch on television, which is not expensive digital television, but just free-to-air television, and hear the voices other than the presidents or this minister or that minister. I'm still optimistic that one day we'll get there.
More Global Village Voices now on Zimbabwe and local media.
Covering Zimbabwe has always been a very tricky subject, but the Western media is not helped. They are normally biased to the situation and not giving out facts of the information of what's going on the ground.
Journalists get paid to write stories that sell. And regarding Africa, what sells is a continent that is crippled by bad leadership and poverty. To do the Zimbabwe story justice, I think what is needed is opinions from real Zimbabweans themselves.
Although newspapers have been licensed, there are no private broadcasters allowed, which means a lot of Zimbabweans are denied an opportunity for an alternative voice to choose what they want to hear.
And finally, one of the truisms of the art of political communications is that if people in power fail to provide information, that informational vacuum will be filled, and often filled in a satirical way. Journalists' lack of access to North Korea, therefore, often results in cartoonish depictions of that country's politics and its leader, Kim Jong-il. This next caricature, our web video of the week, comes courtesy of an animation factory in Hong Kong that's called Next Media. Their take on the de facto announcement of Kim Jong-il's successor borrows some cultural bits from well-known figures from the world of film and sport, Austin Powers and the Harlem Globetrotters, and it takes the visual shorthand of the North Korean political story into some brand new territory. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
前几天，北韩领导人金正日的第三子金正银被晋升至4星军阶，更加接近成为金氏王朝的接班人。金正银是最高领导人的幺子，经过一番严格的筛选后，被选中为北韩的下一位领导人。有媒体报道，北韩的宣传机器已经开跑，将把年轻的金正银捧为一位传奇人物。大将将会是什么样的领导人，有待关注。不过有专家说，金正银像是金正日的翻版。无论如何，看来在金氏王朝下，北韩人民的未来将不会有太大的改变。